On today's video, I'm going to show you how I use an iPad, a pen, 2 pieces of paper, and an old military kneeboard to help me manage all the important cockpit information I'm going to need for a safe and successful flight. Good morning, my name is Steve Rennie. I am the Ren Baron, and this is my Ren Baron Learning to Fly YouTube channel. Now, normally I'd say come along for the ride, but today it might be more appropriate to say pull up a chair here in the hangar with me, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk shop. Now, I can hear the grumbling. Now, come on, Ren, I didn't come to your channel to sit in the hangar. I came here to fly. But the truth of the matter is that some of the most important decisions you'll make, some of the most important lessons you'll learn happen right here on the ground. Now, for the record, I've been flying for a little over 5 years now, and I've been posting videos here on YouTube for a little over 2 years. One of the most important lessons I've learned over the course of those 5 years is the value and importance of managing information in the cockpit. And interestingly enough, over the course of the 2+ years that I've been posting videos on YouTube, the question I most often ask is, what are those 2 pieces of paper you use in the cockpit, and where did you get that kneeboard? On today's video, I'm going to show you how I use an iPad, a pen, 2 pieces of paper, and an old military kneeboard to help me manage all the important cockpit information I'm going to need for a safe and successful flight. The first sheet I use I call my flight info sheet. The second sheet is my takeoff briefing. Today I'm going to focus on the flight info sheet, and I'll do a separate video for the takeoff briefing, which is a little more dialed in for a Cirrus pilot. Now, both the flight info sheet and the takeoff briefing are just simple Google Docs that I designed based on how I like to see the information presented in the cockpit. Now, once I had the forms designed, I sent them to an online printer where I had them bound. That way they're nice and easy to store in my flight bag. So at the start of every flight, once I get to the airport and I'm in that cockpit, it starts the same old way. I go to my flight info sheet and tear off a page. I go to my takeoff briefing, tear off a page, and then I attach them both to my trusty military style kneeboard. Now, I'll leave a link below to the printing company that I used and also a link to the actual military style kneeboard that I use. Okay, now let's talk about that flight info sheet. As you can see right here, it's broken down into 4 different sections. First, we've got flight information up top. Secondly, we have departure information. Third, we have en route information. And finally, we have a section for approach information. Now, some of this information we can get before we get to the airport. Some of the information we're going to get at the airport in the cockpit, but before we take off. A lot of the information we're going to get along the way, and then a tiny little bit at the end of the flight. Now, if I know I'm going to be flying, I like to start that planning process before I even get to the airport. So the first thing I'm going to do to help me fill in the blanks on my flight info sheet is grab my iPad. And when it comes to finding and gathering information, I can't think of a better tool than this little iPad right here loaded up with ForeFlight. It is my absolute go-to best friend in the cockpit. Now, for the record, I use the iPad Mini 4, mostly because it's smaller. I mount it in my pilot side window, and it takes up a little bit less room and blocks a little bit less of the view, but you could use a bigger one if you like. Now, if you've watched my channel all, and I suspect you have, that little plane over my shoulder is an SR22 Gen 6, and it's loaded with that great Perspective Plus avionics system, where all the information that I can get here on my iPad, I can get in the cockpit. The problem is I can't always get in the cockpit, and that's why I love the iPad so much, because it allows me to do a lot of advanced planning and flight planning the night before in the comfort and safety of my hangar here. Now, if you're just getting started with your flight career and you're not familiar with the iPad and the applications, there are 2 primary applications that you can use on the iPad. One is ForeFlight and the other is Garmin Pilot. I've tried them both, and far and away ForeFlight is the best one for me. You can make your own decision. Not a day goes by that I don't thank my lucky stars that I get a chance to fly a plane like that SR22 Gen 6. It's loaded with the greatest technology around. But because of ForeFlight, you don't need to spend $1 million to have that kind of technology. You got it right here. $600 for the iPad, $200 for the 4-flight subscription, and you are good to go. Now, clearly, I'm a big fan of technology, but the problem with technology is every once in a while it can break, and that's a big problem. So I use a big dose of technology with a little dash of paper and pencil as well. Okay, so now let me show you how I use these things. And it all starts here with this iPad in our flight plan. And as you can see here, we're flying from Santa Monica to San Carlos. And once I have that flight plan loaded, I've selected my route, I'm going to push this little button to the left of the edit button, and it's going to send it to the flight section. Now you see a number of options there. I'm going to click on the flight section, and it takes us to this page within 4-flight. Now the beauty of this flight section of 4-flight is that it's an overview of all the key information you'll likely need on a flight here. So you can see here there's all kinds of stuff listed in here. At the top it starts with your departure and destination information, and that's what I'll be using in a second. It's already got my plane preloaded and its performance profile. It highlights the route down there. It shows you what your cruise altitude is, and you can change your cruise altitude right there. It gives you payload information, allows you to set the current fuel you have and so forth, and is really just a wealth of information here. But let's start at the top here in this whole section called Departure Destination. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is put in our departure and destination information up here at the top of the sheet here. That's where I'm going to put in Santa Monica KSMO and KSQL. Now you'll notice that there's some other fields up here at the top that we'll come back to a little bit later, because those are some things that we're going to need to get once we get in the cockpit. Today we're going to get all the stuff before we get in the cockpit. So we'll start next with the radio frequencies. And we're going to start with the radio frequencies at Santa Monica. So to get that, I'm going to push this little button called Info at SMO in the departure section here. And it's going to bring up this little window right here. From there I'm going to click on the Info tab. And there listed are all the frequencies for Santa Monica. Our ATIS 11915, our ground 121.9, and our Santa Monica Tower 120.1. And those are the key frequencies I'm going to list right now. I'll get the departure frequency with my IFR clearance. And I'm going to put those frequencies right up here. Next, we're going to want to get the frequencies at our destination airport. So we're going to go back to the iPad here under the destination section here, and we're going to click the Info button for KSQL. Then we're going to click the Info tab over here, and there are frequencies for San Carlos. 125.9 is going to be our ATIS, 121.6 is going to be our ground frequency, and 119.0 is going to be our tower frequency. And I'm going to record those frequencies right here. Okay, there's one last bit of information that we can get before we get in the cockpit, and that's going to be our field elevation. And to find that field elevation, we're going to go back to the iPad here. We're going to go to the destination information. I'm going to click that little Info button. You can see in the top of this window up here, the field elevation of 6 feet is actually listed. And we're going to record that right here. If you're flying VFR, you'll use that field elevation to help calculate your traffic pattern altitude. If you're flying IFR, you'll use that field elevation to tell you exactly how high over the ground those minimums are. So now we've entered all the information we can get our hands on before we get to the airport. Once I get to the airport and I'm in the cockpit, I'm going to get a couple other pieces of information to fill out the rest of that flight info section. I'm going to start by getting my HOBS information, which I'll use to keep track of my logbook hours. In addition, I'm going to take note of my engine hours, and that's an important number because I use that to help me with scheduling maintenance on the plane. And I'll find that information by looking in the glove box in the cockpit. And the last piece of information I'm going to need to fill out that flight info section is our fuel on board at engine start. Once I've got the avionics fired up, I can find that number at the top of the MFD. Now, quick note here, at the end of the flight, I'll go back through this procedure and get the final totals for HOBS, engine hours, and fuel, and then calculate the flight totals. Now that we've got all that scorekeeping out of the way, we've got our avionics fired up, we've fired up the engine. The first thing I'm going to do now is to contact ATIS and get the weather, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the active runway because we'll be using that information in just a bit. And here's where I'm going to record that. Now, once we've got our weather, the next thing we're going to do is contact ground and get our taxi instructions to the active runway. Now, if you're flying an IFR flight plan, you're going to be looking for your IFR clearance as well. In any event, you'll be posting both of those right here. Once I've got my IFR clearance, I'll take all that information and program that into my FMS, and then I'll double check it one last time against my flight info sheet. Okay, so let's recap a bit. We've got our weather, we know what our active runway is, we've got our instructions to get there, and if we're flying IFR, we've got our IFR clearance. Now I can proceed to the run-up area to make sure the plane is running properly, and from there onto the active runway. But before we head to that active runway, we have one more important piece of business to take care of, and that's the takeoff briefing. Now, as I mentioned previously, I'm going to do a separate video covering the takeoff briefing. But I wanted to mention it now to give you a sense of how the events take place and where that information comes into play. Now, once we've been cleared for departure, the next thing that will happen is we'll take off and we'll talk to that first departure controller, who's going to start giving us the first of a bunch of en route flight information that we'll need to record along the way. And here's where I do that. Now, as you can see, there's not a lot of room in there to write down stuff. So I've developed my own little shorthand for the altitude changes, the descents and climbs, the changes in heading, route changes, and so forth that are part of IFR flight. And 95% of the time, it all works in that little space. Once we get close to our destination airport, we're going to start to use those frequencies that we recorded earlier, and we're going to start with our weather and our ATIS for our destination airport. And we're going to record that right here. Now, when I listen to the ATIS at the destination airport, I'm going to pay particular attention to what runways and approaches are in use. Once I have that information, I can start to brief the approach. Specifically, what I'm going to write down is the actual name of the approach, the runway that we'll be landing on, the approach course, and the nav frequency if it's an ILS or localizer approach. I'm also going to want to know what my initial approach fix is and my final approach fix and the altitude restrictions at each of those. And I'll also want to take note of the minimums for that particular approach. And I'll write that information right here. To get all that information, I'm going to need to look at a chart. And so I got two places to find that. Either I'm going to find it on my Perspective Plus avionics inside the cockpit, or you guessed it, on my trusty little iPad. Okay, so now let's use that chart to fill in all the blanks. We're going to be flying the RNAV Zulu approach to runway 30 at San Carlos. Our final approach course is 297. There is no navigation frequency since it's a GPS approach. Our initial approach fix is going to be AMBI at 3,900 feet. Our final approach fix is going to be CUZUP at 2,000 feet. And finally, one of the last bits of information we're going to want to see on this chart is our missed approach information. In this case, it's going to be a climbing left turn to 5,400, then direct ambi and hold. And I'm going to write that information right here. The last little bit of information we need to fill out that flight info sheet happens at the very end of the flight, and that's our approach and landing clearance. And that's written down right here. Now, as you can see right here, this is really geared toward an IFR flight because the instructions are always the same. It's going to be a turn to join. It's going to be an altitude restriction until established, a clearance for the actual approach that's active on that particular day. And you'll notice over here on the side, there's another little field there for approached arm, which is really what was my reminder to myself to make sure that I'd armed that approach before I got there. In practice, I rarely write that information in there because it all happens so fast, but it's there mostly as a reminder in any event. Okay, so that's how I use that little piece of paper to help me manage all that important cockpit information. And at the end of the flight, it should look something like this. And in case you're wondering, I don't just crumple it up at the end of the flight and throw it in the garbage can. I take that sheet and I put it in my logbook here, a notebook I keep of all the flights that I've flown over the last year, in case I need to reference a flight if I'm going back to somewhere, or if I just need some information. I have it right here in my little flight notebook. Okay, folks, that's how I use my iPad, two pieces of paper, a pen, and my kneeboard to help me manage all that cockpit information. What's important in this video today is not that you do it the same way I do it, but that you come up with a way that works for you, that helps make gathering, in writing down, in managing all that information routine, so that when you're in that cockpit, you know exactly what's going on, you know right where to get to everything. So anyway, I hope that helps you out. If you are interested in seeing this little flight info sheet perhaps as a starting point for your own, I'd be happy to send that to you. I'll leave my email address down in the description here today. And if you send me an email, I will gladly send along the flight info sheet and also the takeoff briefing. My name is Steve Rennie. I am the Ren Baron, and this is my Ren Baron Learning to Fly YouTube channel. I hope you learned something today. Thanks.